Hey, everybody. Welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customers Show. Short episode today, but I wanted to go over some of the latest hot trends and data around what's happening in the digital payments space. So I want to start with this statistic. Between 2019 and 2021, so over this last 2-year period, basically, you know, a lot of which occurred during the pandemic, um, we have gone from 40% of retailers being able to accept contactless payments to 67%. So that's, gosh, almost it was more than a 50% increase, right? 60% increase, something like that, in the number of retailers that are able to accept contactless payments. Obviously, we're up to a vast majority of retailers now able to accept contactless payments. Now, contactless payments include a range of different types of tender, which also include your touch to pay credit card, which you could argue is digital in that it's bits and bytes, but probably not as digital as the world that we think of as being true mobile payments, things like Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, Starbucks, digital payments, etc. But here's an interesting sub statistic under that. In that same period of time, we've now gone to 56% of all retailers accepting some form of phone-based payment. Generally, we're talking about things like Apple Pay and Google Pay. So over half of all retailers, according to a recent study, by the way, by Fit Small Business, are accepting at least one, and many of them are accepting multiple forms of mobile phone-based payments. I think that's huge. And 58% accept tap to pay. So, and then obviously, based on the fact that 67% accept something, you can see, of course, that there are some that accept one and not the other. But nevertheless, the majority are accepting both. So, really interesting and exciting development. And I think this is paving the way for, this is my own prediction, a card-free world within the next 5 to 10 years. I think when we get to the point that nearly all retailers have adopted this, it will no longer be necessary to carry a credit card with you where you go. You can simply use your phone. Now, today, that begs the question, even though 67% of retailers are accepting some sort of contactless and 56% are accepting some form of phone-based payment, what percentage of people are using it? Well, that number continues to grow. We are now at a 36% of the population who are actually using mobile payments. In other words, typically phone, could be like an Apple Watch or something like that, but generally speaking, phone or device-based payments, meaning not some sort of separate card. So we have, more than half of retailers accepting it, and a little more than a third of consumers actually adopting this. And of course, not all consumers have smartphones, et cetera. So, it's going to be a while before we get to 100% on that. But I think as we're seeing less and less expensive smartphones and other kinds of inexpensive devices, such as wearables that can also handle these kinds of mobile payments, and the continued growth, as we said on the last slide, in the adoption of the acceptance technology, I think that this is a trend that is to me, I think it's headed to 100%. And I think we want to be thinking about a future some number of years down the line. It's sometimes easier to tell what the future is than to tell exactly when it's going to arrive. But I think we're going to get to a point where the credit card is a relatively obscure form of payment. We obviously already see some contexts like on airplanes where, they're moving to, they're certainly moving away from cash and to more and more contactless technologies. For example, United Airlines, and this isn't exactly mobile payment, but United Airlines is now encouraging everybody who's flying with them to give them a credit card that they can have in the record for any onboard payments, so that when someone comes to your seat and says, would you like to purchase, a drink or whatnot? If you say yes, they can simply see, oh, you're in seat 7G, you're Howard Tiersky, we have your credit card on file. We'll charge you for it, rather than having you hand them a credit card. And I think obviously, that's not an Apple Pay type payment, but it's still a form of mobile payment in the sense that I'm not having to hand them anything. There's no physical credit card involved. And of course, in the future, that could easily be connected to something that, again, I don't think we're going to see something like an American Express account go away, or a Visa account. It's just a question of how that is conveyed. And so I would say what United is doing is just another example of how you can have some kind of a payment that doesn't rely on a credit card, even though it's proximity based, meaning even though you're there in person, you're still paying without having to present any kind of physical card. And let's see here. And the spend, the amount of money being actually put onto these mobile payments has been continuing to go up year over year. Now, in 2020, as you can see, if you can see this graph, we were growing at about a 23% annual increase in the amount of money being put onto through these mobile payment, these phone-based payment systems. In 2020, there was continued growth, but as the pandemic hit, the growth rate dropped from 24% essentially down to 10%. And obviously, the rationale is logical there. People were home more, they weren't out and about. So the need to use a contactless payment method, such as touching your phone to a POS terminal, wasn't as prevalent because people simply weren't doing that as much. They were ordering more online, that sort of thing, where they may very well have been paying digitally, not using a physical card, but they weren't doing it with their phones using those types of payment methods. But the good news is, for those who are enthusiastic about the growth of this, back in 2021, which is this past year, of course, we saw that growth rate return right to where it had been before. So in 2019, we had a 24% growth rate. And essentially in 2021, we had, again, a 24% growth rate. And that I expect will continue and potentially even accelerate further as the acceptance grows. I want to talk before we leave about one more aspect of digital payments, which are, I want to speak specifically about Venmo, but obviously there are a number of, peer-to-peer payment platforms. Venmo, of course, being the king of them. And you can see from this graph, Venmo's growth in terms of the amount of money that's moving through the Venmo platform has just continued to grow every single year, every single quarter, and even right through the pandemic. And at this point, and these are quarterly numbers. These are quarterly numbers you're looking at. I guess the most recent number in this particular data set from PayPal is from the second quarter of 2021. But in the second quarter of 2021, they did almost $60 billion in money through Venmo. So obviously that would be an annualized rate of $250 billion moving through Venmo. And if that has continued to accelerate, which I'm pretty sure it has based on this graph, it should be greater than that as well. So that's a 57% growth year on year, even all the way through coronavirus. And I think we're going to continue to see this grow significantly. And Venmo is now allowing you to get involved in crypto. So we may also see payments in Venmo in the coming year or two. Right now, you can invest in crypto on Venmo, but you can only pay in dollars. But we may see that evolve as well. But the bottom line is, the adoption of Venmo and similar payment technologies like Zelle would be another example. I just see it in my own life everywhere. My kid's guitar teacher wants to be paid by Venmo. Our landscaper wants to be paid by Venmo. I was actually this past summer at a fundraiser, like an outdoor walkathon fundraiser for my kid's school. And they had one of these raffles set up with little baskets from local businesses that you could buy tickets and bid on. Obviously, that's a very old school type of thing where they give you those tickets, those that have looked the same for 100 years, where you tear them in half, and there's a number printed on one side and they look like old time movie tickets. So they were doing all that just the same as they probably were doing 50 years ago, except if you wanted to buy those old school tickets from I think it was the PTA of my kid's public school here in Mahwah, New Jersey, where I live, they would only take Venmo. So they didn't want to deal with cash, probably a COVID thing. But when you got to the front of the line and you said, I want to buy, $50 worth of raffle tickets, they're like, okay, here's the QR code, scan that, pay by Venmo. So when you see that kind of grassroots adoption of something, I mean, it's really on its way up. So I think these are really interesting. The numbers are interesting to look at, whether it's 26% growth or 29% growth or 31% growth. It might not affect your business a ton, but I think we all need to be thinking about a future when people are going to want to pay for more and more stuff with their phones. And we're going to go from that being, a few years ago, it was kind of a novelty. Only a few early adopters were really doing it. I think we're now at the point where it's mainstream. As we showed in the stats, it's been adopted by more than half of businesses, more than a third of consumers. That's going to continue to grow, whether it's using a traditional method of payment like a bank account or a credit card connected to a system like Apple Pay, or whether it's a more pure payment platform like a Venmo or a PayPal or a Zelle or something else. And this, I strongly believe, is the future. I think the trend numbers support that greatly. So as we're thinking about the payment components of all of our businesses, it's not going to all change tomorrow, but we're on a pretty clear curve. If you just look at that curve on this slide, and of course we see similar curves on all these slides, I think this is going up and up and up to, near 100% penetration. So something to think about in the digital payment space. That's our topic for the day. As always, thanks so much for watching and listening to the Winning Digital Customer Show. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, keep transforming.